Good evening, Leslie. Good evening, Omar, and our guests. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be with you this evening. We're actually this is our first lecture performance done remotely from a third point that is not from our house or from in person in the space, but from Oaxaca, where we're actually just closing an exhibition. Tonight's lecture performance, as Leslie mentioned, we'll look at this sort of thorny issue of alphabet politics. And I will just share my screen already while we're at it, and what it means for alphabets to be assigned certain sounds or sounds to be assigned certain letters. Because we tend to think that alphabets are somehow innocent creatures, that they somehow happen to just, that the A happens to be the A or the A, and so on and so forth. But of course, what we'll be looking at are the kind of the questions of how these arose and why sounds sort of have been either shackled or liberated by these certain letters. Before going into that, I thought I would just give a quick introduction into sort of how we work and what the role of languages and namely books occupy in our practice. We have three main axes of our work, being publications that you see here, lecture performances like this evening's, and exhibitions, sort of what was traditionally considered art in the sense of a material sense. I guess it's important to emphasize that the books that we published, I think 12 or 13 to date, are not catalogs. They're essentially research platforms, and so some of we'll touch upon subjects that have been further discussed in our books, and actually all of our books, to plug it, are available online as PDFs, because some of them have become a little bit inaccessible price-wise, or run out of or no longer available in their print runs. But for us, the book is we have a kind of Abrahamic attachment to the book, in the sense that in some ways the more extensive, elaborate, precious artworks that are created and insured and cost far too much to ship here and forth, or people collect and acquire and museums commission or collectors purchase, they're all essentially in some ways props to bring people back to the book. And the book is really in our attempt in some ways is to reverse that hierarchy and that's traditionally found in the art world, which is that print and book somehow seem to occupy kind of a downstream idea that it's what's most accessible, and it's what people do kind of to raise money for a fundraiser or to document an exhibition. For us, they're anything but that. In fact, the hierarchy is reversed in the sense that the book is really at the top of the pyramid. You won't find anything about us in any of our books because we think that's like the closest thing the art world gets to insider trading. And we believe that should be illegal. Actually, there's such a thing that's called the internet, where you can, if you want to distribute your work, you could do it in a far more sustainable manner. But there's no need to kind of cut trees and to waste everybody's time and muscles sending catalogs of people's work back and forth. I mean, for modernist artists, I understand in the mid 20th century, but there's no reason for somebody in the 21st century to do that, I think. Now, on to tonight's subject matter. This role of history that we'll be looking at and looking backwards at history is something that we share with a mascot of ours called Mola Nasruddin. And the reason why we talk about puckering up and sort of resuscitating history is that, resuscitation is a question of urgency, in the sense that you put your lips onto the lips of history. It's also affective. And I think that some of the themes that are framing in these series of lectures, for us, founding Slavs and Tatars was very much about exploring the different organs of knowledge. We tend to think of knowledge production as a cerebral, analytical function. There's, of course, each organ of knowledge and each organ of language are often overlooked. In some sense, language, we talk about language and the tongue. Mother tongue is a kind of metonymic slippage of some sort, or substitution, but actually, our throats and our ears and our lips and our teeth and our necks are all extremely implements of language, especially other non-Anglophone languages, but also they're all erogenous parts of the body as well, which is very interesting as well, that this idea of sort of how to activate affective parts of the body that are involved in knowledge production and involved in language. And resuscitation has that level of urgency, right? That it's not about kind of a French kiss. It's nothing romantic about it. Nobody asks you to put their tongue on another person's tongue when they're kind of gasping for breath. And Nasruddin is a figure who looks backwards to history to kind of move forward, and he's become a kind of latter-day mascot for us. Because first of all, you find an iteration of him in our entire region. So everywhere from Croatia and the Balkans to China. His name is Afanti, from the Turkic Effendi. The Arabs call him Joha. The Persians call him Mullah Nasruddin. The Turks call him Hoja. And he's a kind of wise fool. You can see this a bit cloudy. Sorry. He's a bit of a wise fool. He's backwards on his donkey, and he's the stories of Nasruddin are equivalent in Muslim cultures. Anywhere there were Muslim societies, you have a version of Nasruddin. And they're the equivalent of, they played a similar role, I guess, of what Brothers Grimm or La Fontaine's fables played in let's say, European societies, in the sense that they impart questions of morality, perspective, but through a very first-degree humor. So typical Nasruddin story is, somebody yells to Mullah Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river? And he yells back, you are on the other side of the river. So a very, very first-degree humor. I mean, a little bit like proto-Ali G, sort of Borat humor, right? That using very, very simple sort of jokes, anecdotes, but behind which are revealed much more complex things. Now, this is something that's a problematic figure, and we won't go into why, but his name is Antoine Compagnon, a scholar at Columbia University 20 years ago, I'm not sure if he still is, at Collège de France, wrote a book about the anti-moderns. And he said that his theory was that the real modernists were not these kind of Marinetti, Mayakovsky, sort of today's Elon Musks, who believe that sort of technology will deliver us from our sort of shortcomings. But actually, the true modernists were those who had a kind of conflictual relationship with the pre-modern era. So he traces in French 19th century literature, from Péguy and Chateaubriand, all the way to actually through Baudelaire to Barthes. Famously, sort of talked about Baudelaire as driving with an eye on the rearview mirror, so always looking back and to make sure that maybe the past wasn't as much of a failure as we think it was, let's say, or it's not something to be as dismissed as easily. Now, putting aside the polemical issues of Compagnon, what's interesting for us is this positioning of facing the past. Like Nasruddin, is often depicted facing the past, but moving into the future, right? This idea of even the languages that I speak are unfortunately all Indo-European, but the way that time is configured in these languages is the past is behind us and the future is ahead of us, which itself shows the kind of positivist failings of our mindset, right? That we think that the past is irrelevant, that's why it's behind us. And we imagine the future is sort of visible to us, and that's why we situate it ahead of us. The only language I've come across that doesn't have that spatial setting of time is Malgache. And in the Malgache language, according to Oyvind Dahl, the past is actually Teo Aloha, and the past is actually in front of you, and the future is considered to be behind you. So it reverses that sort of positivist approach to time. Now, when we did our first Nasruddin sculpture, our only Nasruddin sculpture, we haven't become kind of a one-trick horse, to no pun intended, to just continue to sort of flame Nasruddin. But when we first presented him, what we were essentially doing is the first thing that a child does that rides this horse is asks the guardian, why am I holding an old man's belly, right? Why is this person facing me and not facing the other way around? So the guardian has to impart these questions, quite complex questions of progress, teleology, whatever, history, to a child of 6 or 7 years old. So again, in a kind of bite-sized kernels, in a similar vein that Nasruddin himself, his anecdotes had to do as well. Now, what often sort of characterizes our work as a kind of modus operandi is this idea of sort of bringing together in one space, one page, one voice, two things which are considered to be mutually exclusive or antithetical. And in English, the terms that are used for this are actually mostly Latin-based, or they're not particularly English roots. But my favorite one is coincidentia oppositorum, which is a Christian idea, actually, that to describe the holy, you have to use irrational language, essentially. And this is something you find in sort of everything from Sufi literature to Russian novels of the 19th century, that the language of this world is sort of is a language of a kind of humans, and thus can only capture sort of rational things. But if we want to sort of describe the irrational or the super not rational, we have to use a kind of a non-rational language in some sense. Now, first time that we, for us, transliteration is a way to do this, because it's actually asking again the kind of the Nasruddin-esque question of something very simple, asking very simple, stupid questions to quite complex subject matter. And what I mean by that is that just to compare transliteration with translation for a moment, translation is very esteemed, right? That, you know, from Nabokov to Edgar Allan Poe, there's university departments devoted to it. Jennifer Croft, a translator whom I admire, who's done Olga Tokarczuk's recent, who translates Tokarczuk, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish author. Translators translation is having a moment as a way of, as not just about translation of text, but actually as a conceptual framework of thinking through issues in anthropology, in history, in theology. Transliteration is really the kind of the trashy sibling of translation. Nobody considers it to be important. Nobody really thinks about it. And yet it's something that we do if you don't speak or read or write a non-Latin based language. You're doing this quite often. You know, Greeks who write in Greeklish on SMSs, Arabs, I see all the time, sort of translating the Hamza with, I think with a 3, right, Omar, or finding ways to kind of to approximate a sound in another language with a letter, an alphabet that doesn't necessarily belong to it. Now, even saying that doesn't belong to it assumes that there is an alphabet that belongs to every sound, right? That's itself is false. There is no natural alphabet for any language or for any sound. Here is our first work dealing with transliteration. It's and I guess some of our audience, given the relationship to Cooper Union, is English speaking or native speakers. But for those who aren't, I'll just sort of go through it a bit. Dig the booty of monoglots, but marry my child a polyglot is a dictum, a proverb of our making, which essentially says that if you want to sort of mess around, have a one-night stand, go ahead and do so with somebody who speaks one language. But if you're more serious, if you have sort of real feelings for the person, you know, maybe you should settle for somebody who's a polyglot. Now, usually people who start the sentence in English of dig the booty don't end it with a word like monoglot or polyglot. They're two different registers of language. And this is what I mean by bringing different registers into one space, into one phrase. And even more so is the kind of, you can see above in Cyrillic and the Arabic Persian script, this is the dig da booty in the Cyrillic. In the middle one, it says dig da booty of monoglots, but, because there's no in Cyrillic, so you have to say bat. You can see with the A, B-A-T, marry my child a polyglot. And the same is written above. Now, I want to talk, there's another form of transliteration, which is, it's called homophonic translation. And I think Omar might be familiar with this or not. It's a favorite of mine. And if you read, what's interesting about transliteration also is that you have to enunciate the words. So if you see this text on the right, if you just read it silently to yourself, you won't understand what it's saying. But if you read it out loud, and I'll read it out loud, it says, Ampti dampti setonosal, ampti dampti adegretfal, andolon kin sorces, andolon kit semen, qu'importe ampti dampti together again. So essentially, it's a homophonic translation from the English homophonic sort of Latin alphabet to the French Latin alphabet of Humpty Dumpty. And this is a book of a gentleman who actually went to the effort of homophonically translating to French almost all the Mother Goose nursery rhymes. And the cover you could see is called Mother Goose Rhymes, which is, I guess, the closest you get in French to Mother Goose rhymes. Come back to the idea of coincidental and sort of the two things, you know, geography don't really fit in the same sentence, right? What does the Great Wall of China have to do with the former Berlin Wall? One is from the 13th century, one is from the 12th century, the other one is from the 20th century. And another thing that sort of characterizes these two walls for us are the two geopolitical narratives. that come with it, which is that of communism, political Islam. Normally, you don't put sort of Marx and Muhammad in the same screen, unless you want sort of Molotov cocktails thrown through your virtual window, I guess. But we weren't the first people to do this. Actually, people have been doing this for a while. People, as in sort of some scholars, some sociologists. But one more important person I think I want to talk about tonight is the person on the left, whose name is Norman Brown. Norman Brown was a literary scholar, a Marxist and psychoanalytical literary scholar who was somewhat of a phenomenon in the mid-20th century with the kind of, he became a kind of a darling of the left. Lionel Trilling was sort of obsessed with him. He appeared in the pages of the New Yorker, and he taught at University of California, Santa Cruz, of course, the famous sort of famous hotbed of progressivism, as some people would sort of say. And Norman Brown famously wrote a book where he psychoanalyzed the whole history. But later in his life, he remained a Methodist his whole life. He never was a kind of flower child himself. He never experimented drugs. He remained a Methodist his whole life. But in the last 10 years of his life, he published a book called The Challenge of Islam, which gathers a series of lectures he gave at Tufts University at Columbia from 1981, I think, to 1984, in which he decides, he claims that we cannot understand the Quran until Finnegan's Wake appears. James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake appears, because we don't have the tools of modernist literature to understand the Quran. That if you read even the kind of more sane, less sort of let's say the more substantial scholars of Islam, even in the West, they all kind of come to the conclusion that the Quran is sort of rubbish, so they don't really understand it until the early 20th century. Because time is cyclical, it doesn't have the kind of linear nature of the Old and New Testament. Characters morph into other characters. So you turn a page and Hagar is Joseph, the next page Joseph is Jesus, the next page Jesus is Muhammad. And he says that this is not possible for people to understand in the West until Finnegan's Wake appears. He goes on to claim that 110 of the 114 surahs, the chapter headings of the Quran, can be found in Finnegan's Wake. I guess you could say that you could find anything if you try hard enough in Finnegan's Wake. But regardless, what's interesting about Norman Brown is that he continuously, when he's writing this book, it's in the wake of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which is being refought today as we speak. And he claims that he now quote him. He says that there's two kinds. He says that Islam and communism, he calls them two tired revolutionary forces, two tired old horses, but that we should not take pleasure from their failure, because both Islam and communism agree that there shall be one world or there shall be none. And when you say that, depending on your audience, if you say that in France, there's a very, very sort of characteristic French, like the way the French are the only people I know who actually inhale when they speak and don't exhale, and there's this kind of gasp, because of course they think that one world means one monolithic world, as opposed to one, I think what Norman Brown was saying is that one connected world, right? One coherent world, not suffering from the levels of injustice and sort of social inequality and income inequality that we have in ours. And for us, this is Norman Brown is one way for us to think of Islam through another medium. That is, think of Islam through the idea of the lens of modernist literature, but also, again, to bring Marxism and to bear on Islam, and Islam to bear on Marxism. And that's the nature of kind of one of our works, one of our early books, also called Friendship of Nations, which looks at the relationship between Poland's Solidarność and Iran's revolution. Now, again, back to languages. The first book which deals with the idea of transliteration for us was a book called and it looks at this phoneme in 3 different scripts. You can see the scripts here, sorry. On the tongue here, you can see on the left, there's the Hebrew chet, the X, which is a Cyrillic ch, and the Arabic ch on the right. Now, ch is an interesting one because, again, it's contrary to most sounds that are enunciated, uttered by pushing air through the vocal cord. Ch is about the blockage of air, right? You pronounce ch by blocking some of that air. If you see where above the tongue, there's this kind of 9-looking figure. It's off in the kind of the deep cavity of the mouth. And on the right, there's a qaf in Cyrillic and the qaf in Hebrew. Qaf is even more of a blockage, of course, in Arabic and Central Asian languages. But kh is interesting because in the three Arabic, Cyrillic, and Hebrew scripts, it happens to occupy an important, if you, whatever you want to call it, numerology, symbolism, sort of letter symbolism. So the Arabic script, it has a value of 100. In the abjad, in the Hebrew script, the qaf, sorry, the chet is actually literally the word for life, but also it has the symbol of 8, which is the day of the circumcision. And in the Russian scripts, for example, Khlebnikov, the Russian futurist, he identifies over 40 terms that have to do with habitation. And when you're interested in sort of forensic etymology, you're always looking for the kind of the basic things of ground, sun, sky, shelter. And Khlebnikov identifies 40 words having to do with shelter in Slavic languages, which start with the word kh. A very important sort of role of kh. I used to joke that kh is a kind of anti-imperialist phoneme because the Americans and English can't pronounce it. But that doesn't work when you think of the Dutch, who have lots of kh, and definitely were terrible colonizers. So that sort of theory falls on its head. Now, Khlebnikov also determined or kind of defined an interesting kind of alternative form theory of linguistics, because according to Saussurean linguistics, there's no reason why a letter follows another letter. It's considered to be random. Khlebnikov actually believed in what he called a kind of inner declension of the word, so that giving each letter an agency vis-a-vis the letter that follows it or precedes it. So he took a very famous example of chlam in Russian, which means junk, rubbish. And he said, if you take the L and you change it with an R and you make a chram, it becomes shrine. And the R is sort of sublimating the energy of the ch and makes it sort of sublimates something which is lowly. This inner declension of words also was something that he did in terms of rhyming in his poetry. And I'll read it to you in Russian. We didn't translate this. It's translated by Paul Davies, but the Russian reads Nash kochin ochin azapochin nor atochin tochin ochin. And Khlebnikov had this kind of interior rhyming scheme as well. And it's not badly, it's actually quite well translated. Let us not be heads of lettuce. Let us not let knives upset us. And this interior rhyming scheme, of course, is something which was instrumental in closer to home, or closer to your home, where you guys are in New York, I guess, for somebody like Notorious B.I.G., because he actually came onto the scene by using rhyming within the line as opposed to sort of at the end of the lines. An example is right here.
We used to fuss when the landlord dissed us. No heat, wonder why Christmas missed us. Birthdays was the worst days. Now we sip champagne when we thirsty.
Now, Khlebnikov was considered to be, he was called a kind of Russian dervish. And the reason why he was considered a Russian dervish, not because he converted to Islam, but because he made a journey, a very famous journey across the Caucasus into what was then Persia or Iran. And he looked so bad in sort of his ripped outfit and garments and this unshaved and long hair that people thought he was, the Persians thought he was a dervish. And he went there to support a kind of short-lived socialist republic on the Caspian Sea called the Republic of Gilan. Now, Khlebnikov, when we did a show at the MoMA in 2012, we used Khlebnikov's theory called Za'um. Za literally means across or trans, and means sort of rationalism or wit or brain intelligence. And all the translations we found were sort of falling short, like they were very clunky, like trans, rational, which felt very scientific or clinical. And we came across a translation of his Za'um, which was actually beyond sense, which I thought was fantastic because beyond sense has the word nonsense in it, of course, which is important to Khlebnikov and that current of Dadaist sort of futurist poetry. Khlebnikov also was somebody who he refused the term futurist because he thought it was a Latin loan word. So he preferred the Slavic word budutlyane, which uses the word budushi in the Slavic version of future, sort of futurism. We also decided that Beyond Sense would be a perfect name for the exhibition at the moment because it also has within it Beyonce, which I think Khlebnikov, who believed in this kind of interior declensions of words, would have been happy with this kind of a fortuitous sort of a coincidence. This is the gentleman that Khlebnikov went to support, whose name was Mirza Kuchak Jangali, who, as I said, he was short-lived kind of a forest revolutionary, leftist revolutionary, propped up by the Soviet Union. I think 9 months this republic lasted on the coast of the Caspian Sea in 1920. When we did this exhibition, we placed what's called a kind of kitab kebab outside of the main space, and this kebab is something of a I guess a thumbnail of our practice, in the sense that it really goes to this idea of, as I mentioned, this other organs of knowledge, right? That we've been so much under the aegis of Cartesianism, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, that we've spent so much time the past 600 years on the brain that we've kind of forgotten that there's other intelligent, articulate organs in our bodies. And part of what we're trying to understand are, what are those organs? What are they trying to say? There's a digestive knowledge. And today, actually, I've been told that medical students training in neurology are asked nowadays in the West to study gastroenterology as well, because the West has finally understood that the digestive system is an equally articulate series of organs, or yet we don't understand what it's trying to say. Of course, Indian traditions or Chinese traditions have acknowledged that, or have understood that for thousands of years. But in the West, it's a relatively new thing, and as we can see by the kind of the rise of Ayurvedic medicine in the West, for example. But for us, this idea of digestive knowledge, I mean, there's metaphysical knowledge, there's emotional knowledge, and these knowledges, of course, happen to be associated with certain organs in our bodies, right? Whether the emotional knowledge is associated with the heart, the digestive with the stomach or intestines, affective knowledge with other organs. And another example of sort of transliteration as activating these different organs is the idea of came through, and actually in a translation work we did of Mullah Nasruddin. Now, this is a different Nasruddin in the sense that this is a satirical publication published in Azerbaijan and Georgia in the Caucasus from 1906 to 1930. And it uses the mascot of Mullah Nasruddin that I just spoke about, simply as a kind of MC, as a master of ceremony. And in each of these issues, this has been arguably the most important periodical of the 20th century Muslim world. It was read from Morocco all the way to Egypt, to India, and it was largely read because it was largely illustrated. Because of course, much of the people who could read this weren't literate, so couldn't read at the time. We translated this in 2011, and it's one of our more successful books, and that's why we published a second edition in 2017. And we just did a selection of the drawings and the captions that came with it. It was very progressive for women's rights. Here's a kind of satirical drawing showing the relationship of a Muslim man to his Muslim wife, and the same man with his Russian lover. So kind of poking fun at the double standard vis-a-vis Christian women and Muslim women. It was quite instrumental in Azerbaijan granting women the right to vote in 1917 or 18, sort of also, which just complicates the narrative that Islam is somehow necessarily, Muslim countries are necessarily oppressive of women, even in the cases where they are. This is a case where the right to vote was given at least 4 or 5 decades before most Western European countries. And in addition to this kind of feminist sort of stance, it was instrumental in putting Azerbaijani as a language as opposed to a dialect. So until that time, in the Turkic languages, if you publish them, you either published in Russian, the language of the empire, sort of the imperial language, or you published in sort of Istanbul Turkish, official Ottoman Turkish. And here you can see illustrations of sort of tongues being cut out of an Azeri man on the top at left, another tongue being stitched in its place, a Russian tongue. On the right, you can see a kid sort of asking the parents, the instructor, why do we need another tongue? Why do we need the Russian? We have our own language. Now, what we became most interested in was the idea that why were there so many different scripts on one page? You have on the top, you have Arabic, in the middle, you have Cyrillic, and on the bottom, you have Latin. The reason for this is as Leslie mentioned in the introduction, the kind of the politics of the Bolsheviks towards the Muslim subjects was to cut them off from their Muslim heritage. So by cutting them off from the Arabic script, they'd be forced into modernity. So until 1929, these are not Arabic languages. These are not Semitic languages. These are Turkic languages mostly, and Persian one. But let's say, everybody from Azerbaijan to Dagestan to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they were Turkic languages that were forced to change from Arabic into Latin between 1929 and 1939. And then in the interim, of course, Turkey and Ataturk have changed. So Stalin becomes paranoid about pan-Turkism. Somehow these peoples can become could unite. And he changes it back in 1939. He changes it back. He changed it to Cyrillic. So and then in 1991, many of them upon independence go to Latin. So you have this very strange phenomenon where you have 3 generations, a mother, let's say a grandmother, a daughter, and a granddaughter who can speak the same language but can't read the same book. In essence, becoming immigrants within your own language, right? Very uncanny, strange thing. It does, of course, devastations in terms of intellectual heritage and sort of cultural legacy. Now, I know we're running a bit short on time, so I'll go a bit. Okay. Another interesting thing is that when the way that Islam came into the Russian Empire and to Russian language, sorry, not the Russian Empire, but into the Russian language, was through Russia and not through the other Cyrillic using languages, namely not through Ukrainian and Belarusian. And that means that when Russian transliterates the word Allah, they use the X on the right, and which in Russian is Allah. But of course, Allah we have a H in Arabic and in Persian, but we don't, it's not H that we use for Allah, right? It's a H, but there is no H in Russian. Belarusian and Ukrainian have this H, but because it didn't come through those languages, the Russians sort of had the supremacy over it. And in fact, the G, this is the G in Belarusian, and in Ukrainian is pronounced as a H. So actually, it would have been more phonetically appropriate if the Quran or if Islam had been transliterated through the Belarusian and the Ukrainian scripts as opposed to the Russian ones. I'll give you just another example of letters in the Belarusian language. There was Tatars living in Belarus from the 14th century on, and they used to speak Belarusian, they used the Arabic script. And these are some of the letters. The Z, there's a Z in Belarusian, and there's a Ts, which don't exist in the Arabic scripts that I know of. And maybe something we could talk about afterwards in the discussion with Omar is that I've never understood why whenever there's a sound that the Arabic alphabet cannot accommodate, it's always the 3 dots that become a kind of signifier of foreignness. So when you go to the Emirates and you go to Louis Vuitton, there is no V in Arabic. So the Vav or the U is put 3 dots and it becomes a V. It's something I haven't still been able to understand. Or all the four Persian letters, let's say, that don't exist in the Arabic alphabet, all have the 3 dots: the P, the Ch, the J, as well. Another example of homophonic translation, actually, no, this is a transliteration, sorry, is a fantastic book by David Melnick, an artist and poet, who transliterated the entirety of the Iliad into a homophonic and homoerotic translation at the same time. This is just one page. And if you can kind of make out, I can't make out Greek, but I can approximate because Cyrillic kind of comes from, I guess, in some ways it's close to the Greek. But look on the first line that you can see, and he's homophonically translated. So it's a literal transliteration or homophonic translation. And it says, aid us to make gay toast if you ain't a kissed A-OK. And you can actually see through the Greek letters on the top left. Aid us to make a gay toast. It's a fantastic, and so I highly recommend the book. It's called Men in Aida by David Melnick. So Paul Gilroy, my mistake, I'm talking about another lecture. Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher who, for better or worse, somehow mentored the current president of France. He has a fantastic text on translation where he claims that translation is a form of linguistic hospitality. That by translating, we're essentially inviting the foreigner into our language. and we're expropriating ourselves into the language of the foreigner. In which case, we try to take that further and say that the transliteration is a form of transvestism of language, in a sense that it's assuming the identity of another script, but as opposed to and it's a choice. It's as opposed to kind of the essentialist doctrine of translation. A couple examples of transliteration I'll go through in our own region, which falls somehow weirdly outside of the Manasa. When the Muslim world is defined, it's defined by this Cold War acronym, Manasa, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. And this is one of the reasons we do Slav. Why Slav and Tatars exist is because the first thing that comes to your mind is what the hell happened to Bukhara, Samarkand, Baku? Where is Central Asia here? Where is the Caucasus? Are these not Muslim nations? And they're not, because we still use a Cold War leftover, that we think that somehow they were communized and they were atheized because they drink vodka, then they're not Muslim somehow. And one example of transliteration, interesting one, is the Jews of Bukhara, who actually live not very far from Cooper Union in Rego Park in Queens now. There's no more Jews left in Bukhara, unfortunately. I think there's one Jew left in Bukhara, but there was a sizable Jewish population in Bukhara and Samarkand, Central Asia. And they used to, and the language they speak is a language called Bukhari. And Bukhara is considered to be one of, I think, the fourth most holy place in Islam, according to many of the hadiths. You know, there's Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, and then there's Bukhara. That's, according to legend, there's so many saints in Bukhara that it's one of the only places where light shines onto the heavens and doesn't receive light from the heavens. You know, and the Jews of Bukhara use a script which is Hebrew to speak a Persian language. So the Jews of Bukhara speak Persian, my native language, but they use a Hebrew script to do so. A kind of lower brow version of transliteration that we can talk about is this, you know, very famous vulgarization of the Shakespeare to be or not to be. You find this on kind of American campuses, Amsterdam kind of party places, this idea of to be or not to be, which is really it's really kind of it's a vulgarization. Essentially, it's making an existential question into a question of consumption, right? To be or not to be becomes a question of to drink a beer or not to drink a beer. Now the question becomes, how do we reverse that? How do we bring back the existential gravitas into the act of drinking a beer? Because if Francisco here, my colleague, drinks a beer or doesn't, it makes no difference. It's purely a question of consumption. But if I drink a beer, or if Omar drinks a beer, it's not exactly a question of consumption. It engages other questions. So we thought, okay, what if you just transliterate it into Arabic? So to beer or not to beer, for a Muslim to drink a beer becomes a question of transliteration, of identity, of community, of belonging, and other questions as well. Another example of transliteration is the German language, which is to tell this story, you have to understand the kind of the politics of the First World War. For those who are not familiar with, you know, Germany's colonial enterprises, Germany was very late to the colonial game, with no less disastrous consequences, but in a very short period of time. In 1914 or 15, the Axis powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, they draft a policy, which was the policy of setting the East aflame. And what they do is, what the Ottomans do is, the Ottomans declare a jihad, and they declare a jihad on the Entente powers, so on England, France, and Russia. Why? Because the majority of Muslims were living under the Entente powers' imperial occupation, right? From the Middle East to Asia, into the Russian colonial territories. And when they declare this jihad, it's of course a partial jihad. It's a jihad against certain infidels, but on the side of other infidels. And the Germans, they actually build the first functioning mosque on German soil, which is in Zunsdorf, in Zossen, about 70 kilometers outside of Berlin. Ironically, also one of the largest migration processing centers in 2015. But this mosque no longer exists. And this mosque was a kind of a propaganda piece. Essentially, they gathered all the Muslim prisoners of war of the First World War, during the First World War, put them here as prisoners of war, but they treated them very well to show the rest of the Muslims of the world, the Muslims that were fighting against the Axis powers, that look, this is how we treat our prisoners of war. Imagine how we treat you. Basically, rise up, we will be your friend. Germany's on your side. So they had games, they had halal food, they had this mosque, and they published the Germans published a newsletter as a kind of, again, a propaganda kind of piece called El Jihad. So one of the first examples of instrumentalization of political Islam by Western nations, which we've seen throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, us being obsessed with sort of transliteration and alphabet politics, we looked at, we were just obsessed with the way that jihad is transliterated into the German language. And have a look in the masthead underneath the Arabic jihad is jihad with 4 letters, D-S-C-H. That's quite a mouthful for one sound, right? Like j in German is written D-S-C-H. Why? Because ironically, there is no j in German. So you have to approximate the j in German. And the way to approximate the j is through these 4 letters. So the first thing I asked was, can I have a look at a Duden, which is the kind of the Oxford English Dictionary of the German language. I'd like to know what other words start with a D-S-C-H. And it reads a kind of a greatest hits of Orientalism. It's just, it's too much. You have to have a look for yourselves. These are some of the words in the Duden that start with a D-S-C-H. The Jalaba, the North African garment. Genghis Khan, jihad, of course. Jama, the kind of the Muslim community, I guess. Jadidismus, Jaina, Jungle Fever. And of course, this is the German language's unconscious way of identifying certain words as or certain juz as foreign. Because if you go to Berlin today and you order a gin and tonic, it's not written with a D-S-C-H, I promise you. Or if you buy a Levi's jeans, or you want to talk about gentrification, it's written as Gentrifizierung with a G. Jogging shoe in German is written with a J. But D-S-C-H is used for the kind of the other, the language, the juz of the other, the juz of the kind of the foreign juz in some sense. When they do this, when they declare this jihad, the first thing that England does is responds as saying that this is the jihad made in Germany. With the broken letters that Omar will appreciate, is the kind of the way that the people who don't understand Arabic write Arabic, right? They use these kind of letters that don't actually match the Microsoft Word approach to the Arabic language. And the reason, when England accuses the Axis powers of the jihad made in Germany, again, I can think of a lot of ways to criticize the jihad, but made in Germany is not the first one that comes to mind. Because when I think of something made in Germany, I think of it, what does that mean? Is it like a well-engineered jihad that's going to cost a lot more, but will last longer? Because that's not the kind of, I guess the question is of illegitimacy is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of made in Germany. You think of kind of quality and precision. But that was the message, right? That this is not a jihad made in Baghdad or in Mecca or Medina, but in Germany, essentially. We have 5 minutes, Omar, Leslie. Yeah. I'll end with the Turkic languages because, of course, they're the kind of bookends of our not only of our geographic remit, but this language study or this kind of transliteration study. This is a map of the Turkic languages. And of course, the most important, one of the more important of these Turkic languages is the Uyghur language. The Uyghur language is the only Turkic language today written and still in an Arabic script, which again, let's understand just the kind of the singularity of this is that the Turkic language that's still using the Arabic script is the Turkic language the furthest away from Turkey, first of all. Because Turkey is actually kind of the endpoint of the Turkic language, right? The Turkic language is originated somewhere up here in the up north, and then sort of in the Mongol, sort of North China, southern Russia parts of the world, and migrated westwards towards Turkey. And then while it migrated westwards, it moved progressively towards the front of the mouth. So you lose the q, for example. Turks no longer can say q. Uzbeks still say q. Kazakhs still say q. The Erdogan with a kind of absent G is the kind of, in some sense, a replacement of that. But the Uyghurs still uses Turkic alphabet, the Arabic alphabet, and they do so in a way because the People's Republic of China, who's quite violently oppressing them for the past several years, decided in 1983 to change their alphabet from Latin to Arabic. A very interesting time to change an alphabet to Arabic. Some people ascribe a kind of long-term vision of the rulers of the People's Republic of China that somehow they knew that glasnost and perestroika were going to lead to the independence of Central Asian states. like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, that could be mutually intelligible, so that they kind of anticipated this somehow. I don't think this is true, but they wanted to find a script that was no longer intelligible, so they went back to Arabic. Now, the most successful story of language conversion in the world, or sorry, script conversion in the world, is the story of the Turkish language. Because whatever you think of Ataturk, it's incredible that in 80 odd years, it's an open and shut case. Even the most batshit crazy Salafist in Turkey doesn't want to bring back the Arabic script, right? It's done. The Turkish language is in Latin today. It doesn't belong in any other script. To be fair to Ataturk, there were reasons beyond ideology. Of course, he wanted to hitch the future of the country to the West, which is why he looked at the Latin alphabet as a kind of as a progressive alphabet. Leslie mentioned in the introduction that the Latin alphabet was accompanied by Roman Catholicism, and yet it became a kind of a millennium later. It became the symbol for the past several hundred years. It's become the kind of the alphabet of secularism, ironically enough. So there were even Russians in the Bolsheviks who believed that Russian should be secularized because the Orthodox script was sullied by its relationship to the Orthodox faith. Sorry, the Cyrillic script was sullied by the association with the Orthodox faith. Now, to be fair to Ataturk, as I said, the Turkish alphabet has 8 or 9 vowels that don't exist in the Arabic alphabet. At best, the Arabic has 4 vowels that you write in letters. The rest are diacritics, 3 vowels, 4, and 8 is almost double that. Namely, this and u, the ones you see with the 2 dots, the umlauts. But of course, when you change alphabets, you also lose certain sounds. And one of the sounds the Turks lost was they had 2 N's. They had a nasal N and they had a normal N, an N like never, but they used to have an N which was like this. And if you pronounce to yourself, you'll see that it's through the nasal cavity that it's pronounced. It also sounds extremely Asian. I mean, you can look on Wikipedia, there's an entry for and there's millions of people in China named NG. It's a male name, first name. If you want to order water spinach in a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, you order choi, right? So the nasal cavity is used in Chinese and the tonals, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Ataturk ditched this of other letters. This it's not a coincidence. This happened to kind of fall by the wayside because it's a reminder of Turkish's Eastern origins in some sense. And again, the 3 dots, right? The in the Ottoman was written with a kef. It's called kef and nuni in Persian. There's 3 dots on the kef. Now, there was a. I'll finish with an example of the Hebrews, because if you're aware, of course, the Hebrew alphabet or the Hebrew language, sorry, was a liturgical language until the Zionists in the late 19th century decided that it should be also a daily vernacular language. And there was a lot of debate because most of the Zionists in Palestine at the time were European Jews, and European Jews had been using Latin scripts. There was a debate whether there should be a distinction between liturgical Hebrew should remain square letters, let's say, and vernacular Hebrew should be Latin. And the Singer brothers, actually, some of them were involved in this push to make it a Latin script, the vernacular. And İlker Ayturk, a Turkish scholar with whom we worked, who teaches at Bilkent University, he does a very interesting comparative study of why certain script conversions work and others don't. He has a criterion, kind of a checklist. First of all, you have to have a inferiority complex vis-a-vis the script you're changing to. Turks vis-a-vis Latin had an inferiority complex in 1926, 27. The Central European Jews in Palestine didn't towards Latin. The level of literacy is also important, of course. Literacy in Turkey around 1926 was about 8%. And amongst the Zionists of Palestine, it was around 20%. So I will end with a quote on this topic from Marshall McLuhan, of all people, who says that the Greek myth about the alphabet was that Cadmus, repeatedly the king who introduced the phonetic letters into Greece, sowed the dragon's teeth, and they sprang up as armed men. Languages are filled with testimony to the grasping, devouring power and precision of teeth, that the power of letters as agents of aggressive order and precision should be expressed as extensions of the dragon's teeth is natural and fitting. Letters are not only like teeth visually, but their power to put teeth into the business of empire building is manifest in our Western history. Thank you very much.